Good evening. We are so glad you could join us tonight for the second MFI virtual book club. This month, we've been reading Ryan T. Anderson's When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment. Massachusetts Family Institute, this moment has already lasted well over a decade, but it has evolved drastically in that time. When I joined MFI in 2012, the leading edge of transgender activism was characterized by men my age dressed in skirts and heels pushing non-discrimination legislation at the State House in Boston. Legislation that then first-time candidate for Governor Charlie Baker promised he would not sign. Now, fast forward a few years, and those cross-dressing men were replaced as spokespersons by young women with short haircuts and masculine or androgynous clothing. Shortly after that, we began seeing mostly children, either high school girls who claimed to be boys or prepubescent elementary school students who identified as the opposite sex. The rhetoric changed too. It was no longer about equal rights for adult sexual expression, but rather the need to recognize and affirm whatever gender identity a young person asserted, because if we did not, they were likely to commit suicide. And under the assault of that manipulative rhetoric, virtually all establishment resistance to the transgender agenda in Massachusetts collapsed. In 2016, Governor Baker signed the infamous bathroom bill that he had originally promised to veto, opening up women's bathrooms, locker rooms, shelters, and other intimate spaces to sexually deviant men. Now, we're at the point where people are at risk of losing their job if they do not use the preferred pronouns of a coworker, or if they decline to give a Brazilian bikini wax to a man who identifies as a woman. True story. I have a copy of the man's complaint right here from the Attorney General's office. And perhaps most disturbing of all, parents are increasingly being cut out of medical decisions for their children and even risk losing custody if they are seen as insufficiently supportive of their child's cross-sex identification. On top of all this, it's become almost impossible to even discuss this issue publicly. When USA Today recently named Dr. Rachel Levine, a biological man and the father of 2 children, Woman of the Year, because he identifies as a woman, the satirical news site Babylon Bee named him their Man of the Year. And over the weekend, they were locked out of their Twitter account, which has 1.3 million followers, because the censors there deemed it to violate their rules against hateful conduct. And of course, the book we're discussing tonight was suddenly removed from Amazon after nearly 3 years of successful sales for allegedly violating the online retailer's content policy. Now, the author will be joining our conversation at about 7:30 tonight. But to start things off, I'm joined once again by my book club co-host, Alana Stubblebine. She's the leader of Refresh Ministries and the mother of 6 daughters. So these issues of safety, the suppression of free speech, and the destruction of women's sports that come with the transgender movement are all things she and her family are dealing with now and have dealt with in the past.
Yes, it's hard to believe that I've raised 6 girls in the public school system. I feel like I could write a book at this point, but I will tell you that I will never forget my first introduction into this indoctrination. It's when my now 20-year-old was in 3rd grade. So that was about 2015. And the beloved math teacher, Mr. Dexter, he was a homosexual, but he was the best teacher in the whole school. Well, he stopped the math lesson to show a Schoolhouse Rocks video. It's a famous video. You probably remember the magic number 3. And there's a video of the mother and the wife and the baby. And the kids had to sing a song, A Man and a Woman Make a Baby. And he stopped it to say, no, that's politically incorrect. A man and a man can make a baby, and a woman. They had to re-sing the song. So Annika came home from school so confused about multiplication. She just was all over the place. So I had an appointment with the principal. And I said, you need to promise that you won't teach an agenda in my daughter's classroom or I'm going to withdraw her from the school. And he looked at me dead on and he said, Mrs. Stubblebine, I will not do that. We are at the vanguard of the next civil rights movement and I am the champion. Well, a couple years later, it was so sad. A couple years later, the very first fully transitioned 3rd grader came from that classroom. That teacher. So it is just, it's hard to believe. So we've dealt with this now for all these years. And just this week, as I was leaving, this came in the mail. It's for the town of Lincoln where I live. And it's just the budget for the schools. And it's the item, $6,000 for parks and trails. $71,000 was allocated and approved to hire a new inclusion, diversity, and equity learning coach. So there you go.
And you've talked a lot about how there's another news story you read where a mother was complaining that her daughter, I think it was her daughter, was essentially coached into transgender.
Well, just this week, if you noticed, it was on the news on Fox News, Jessica Conan. It was a parent who got up at a school board in California, and she was complaining because 2 teachers were coaching. So now they have this new thing where they're hiring coaches to enter the school, the classrooms, and they're equity coaches. And so this particular daughter was coached to transition without any knowledge from the parent or approval. They changed her medical records, her name. This is right now going on in California.
And we've seen it here in Massachusetts as well. Unfortunately, parents have contacted the MFI office for help because teachers at elementary schools and middle schools are promoting transgenderism and counseling kids to socially transition and not telling the parents, intentionally hiding that information from the parents. That's something that Ryan talks about in this book. But I mean, as you mentioned, it's there in the
it's the civil rights movement.
This issue is everywhere right now. A decade ago, when I would try and speak at churches and talk about this issue, a lot of pastors, for example, didn't want to engage on this issue at that time. But now they're coming to us looking for help because it is now in their pews. The children, in particular, of the men and women in their congregation are at least being confronted with this at school. And many of them, tragically, are actually getting sucked into that lifestyle. And it starts with a social transition. So a child will go by the opposite sex pronoun, a new name. But then we're seeing cases now where children at age 11, 12 are being put on puberty blockers to stop the natural and healthy process of puberty.
Well, this was a 3rd grader in our school, Lincoln, a 3rd grader fully transitioned. So that was even earlier. I think the age, it's just unbelievable. But fast forward now, these kids are through high school. My 10th grader got in the car the other day and she just said, Mom, all of the kids all my friends are bisexual and they're all pressuring me. So it used to be that we would pressure kids, to smoke marijuana or cigarettes, but now the pressure of the day, and for whatever reason, it seems to be affecting girls more.
That's right. And I've seen that anecdotally as well, particularly young women age, 12, 13, 14, 15, kind of early teens. And oftentimes in groups. So statistically, the most aggressive statistic I've seen anywhere is about 10% of children identifying as somewhere on the gender spectrum. But even as recently as a few years ago, transgender activists were saying, it's less than 1%. So it's really exploded, and you'll see it done in sort of clusters. So there'll be 3, 4, 5 girls, all best friends at the same school, kind of coming out, transitioning at the same time.
Yeah. My daughter's friend group, they grew up going through these with Mr. Dexter. and here they are now in high school trying it out. It's amazing.
And I want to read a quote from the book where Anderson talks about this, sort of changing it from what was an adult fetish, when I was first engaged in this issue of MFI, to now a childhood pathology. Page 132, if you've got the book at home, he says, because of an ideological commitment to the view that adults who identify as transgender should be affirmed in their identity, activists want to treat children the same way, taking their gender dysphoria to be a manifestation of a deep and permanent reality. That is why over 45 gender clinics popped up in the United States from 2007 to 2017, that's already 5 years ago. At this point, I looked this morning, there are now over 60 gender clinics focusing on children alone. So 60 pediatric gender identity clinics, with 5 currently in Massachusetts. And as Anderson points out, quote, the people increasingly in the spotlight of the transgender moment are children. In 2007, again, ancient history at this point, but in 2007, Boston Children's Hospital became the first major program in the United States to focus on transgender children and adolescents. So once again, I mean, that teacher was right.
That would make sense.
He is in the vanguard.
Right, so it was shortly after,
of that movement, tragically. Now, the good news is children who wrestle with gender identity issues, if they are affirmed in their actual sex, their true bodies, their true anatomy and biology, they essentially grow out of it at a rate of between 80 and 95%. That's what the studies show. That's what one of the resources we have available called the Parent Resource Guide for Transgenderism. Has all kinds of helpful statistics. It breaks down the accurate studies on this issue in a way that you're probably not going to find anywhere else, certainly not in the mainstream media or in the public schools or even in the medical establishment. And you can get that from our website. If you go to the mafamily.org website, go to the resources tab, there's a way to download that as a PDF. We also have some hard copies at the office. You can email or call the office in the morning. We'll get those sent out to you. It's a great resource for parents, for pastors. But the good news is if we can help children out of this mess, if they're given help early on that is not pushing them towards the puberty blockers and then the cross-sex hormones and ultimately surgery.
Well, that's so hopeful, Andrew, because I know a friend of mine has her own practice in Woburn as a child psychologist, and she has a 3-year wait list. And she told me that if a child comes in wanting to transition, she is not allowed to ask one question about how they're feeling, what makes them think that, or anything. She is instructed to hand them literature about how to proceed. And I asked her, I said, but as a counselor, they're coming to you for help. That's one problem they cannot address and give answers to. They just have to point them to the doctors who can give them the operation.
Well, and that stems from, in part at least, from a 2019 bill that we fought for years called the counseling ban. And what it essentially does is it outlaws any type of treatment, so even talk therapy, that would dissuade a young person from embracing a gender identity that is different from their own sex. That was sold to the legislature as stopping electroshock therapy for people who have same-sex attraction or things like that, which we found no evidence of that ever being practiced in Massachusetts, let alone happening now or being a problem. But what it actually does, and I think what it's intended to do, some people actually admitted this at the testimony of the State House at the time, is to stop the speech, the First Amendment rights of counselors who are just, in these cases, trying to help young men and women feel comfortable in their own bodies. So the state of the law in Massachusetts right now, as your colleague, your friend, is experiencing, is that if you have a young, say, 14-year-old girl who thinks she might be a boy, if you take her to counseling, she can get put on puberty blockers, put on testosterone, be set up for double elective mastectomy as top surgery, and you'll be parent of the year. No problems for the doctors or the counselors if they do that. But if they try to make her feel comfortable in her own body as the girl that God created her to be, they could lose their license, and DCF can get involved and potentially even take the kid away. That's the reality we're dealing with.
It's amazing.
We're trying to look into ways to roll that back legally, because it is a violation of the First Amendment rights to free speech, among other things, for the doctor and for the patient, the client, to be able to hear that. And there has been success legally down in Florida at the federal level in invalidating some local city laws that were quite similar.
So if a parent calls you looking for answers, do you have maybe information out of state or any place you can direct them to a counselor that is willing to go rogue?
We have built sort of an informal network of counselors who will counsel in a way that's consistent with the parents' beliefs and with the reality of biology and anatomy, and do so in a way that really is just trying to resolve the underlying issues that then present as this sort of gender dysphoria. Typically what I'm told counselors and therapists find is that there's an underlying depression or anxiety or some trauma that then manifests as sort of this gender dysphoria is the term that's used now. So a disconnect between an internal sense of self and the physical body. And if you resolve those underlying issues of anxiety, depression, trauma, etc., then the gender confusion tends to resolve itself as well. And that feeds into that statistic of 80 to 95% of young people resolving over time.
There was a really great quote in the book by that Dr. McHugh, which I know you're going to talk about.
And for people at home that maybe haven't read the book, right? Okay. Paul McHugh was a doctor at Johns Hopkins who ran one of the earliest gender clinics, but he found that a lot of what they were doing wasn't actually helping people. And so he tried to kind of shut it down and has now become an outspoken advocate for a much more sensible approach to these issues.
I felt like he was kind of the Dr. Malone of getting attacked. But here's his quote. It's on page 18. It says, "I am ever trying to be the boy among the bystanders who points to what's real. I do so only because truth matters, but also because overlooked amid all the hoopla, stand many victims. And that just should be the heart of behind everything, is the victims.
Right, these young people aren't being victimized by this ideology. In fact, McHugh at page 133 describes it as a cult. He says that school counselors in particular, quote, like cult leaders, may encourage these young people to distance themselves from their families and offer advice on rebutting arguments against having transgender surgery. He says what these young people need is to be removed from this suggestive environment and be presented with a different message. But as Anderson then goes on to say, the proliferation of gender clinics in America and gender identity programs in the schools, and we've seen a lot of those make it less likely that children will get the help they need. And instead, they find gender counselors who encourage them to maintain their false assumptions of this gender identity. And we're just seeing that really explode over the last couple of years in the public schools. So many calls for help to our office of parents trying to navigate this issue. And it's very difficult because all these sort of institutions are arrayed against them. The schools are pushing this issue, the medical establishments pushing this issue, the libraries, the media, even the courts to some degree. We had one mom who had a daughter who was, I think, not even 12, and there was a youth gender clinic in Boston, convinced the mom to have the daughter get a puberty blocker inserted into the arm, a 2-year slow release puberty blocking device, and then is trying to put the daughter, again, who's not even 14 now, on testosterone.
It's terrible.
To transition, and those are not reversible. So, and Anderson talks about the fact that puberty blockers are not reversible, and certainly cross-sex hormones are not reversible. Young women will, get like a permanent 5 o'clock shadow. Their voice permanently is lowered and changed. That is not reversible. And depending on the extent to which they take the cross-sex hormone, they're rendered infertile, both male and female.
Well, I was shocked to learn in the book about, the very first transgender, that one of the twins, how they committed suicide. Nobody, that is totally kept under wraps. Right. Nobody knows about that.
Dr. John Money, who, and Anderson talks about this in his book, and I was going to ask him about it when it comes on, but just in brief, so Dr. John Money was the originator of the term gender identity. And he first started experimenting with a set of twins, two males, two boys. One of the boys had a botched circumcision, so there was a physical damage to his genitalia. And this Dr. Money convinced the parents to allow him to essentially raise one of the boy with the damaged genitalia, as a female from an early age, and had the two youth engage in sexual positioning with each other, try and reinforce this female identity. And the tragedy is both of those young men later in life committed suicide.
Yeah, Andrew, I had to do a little bit of extra research because this story was so fascinating to me. I found that in this book, every couple pages, I did a little extra research because there were so many interesting things. But this was about these two boys. So the 2-year-old that was the first transgender, they called him Brenda. And it said at age 2, Brenda angrily tore off her dress. She refused to play with dolls and
his dress, right?
His dress, yes. Sorry. No, and beat up his brother and seized his toy cars and guns in school. He was relentlessly teased for his masculine gait, tastes, and behaviors. He complained to his parents, I'm trying to change the pronouns. Yeah. He complained to his parents and teachers that he felt like a boy. And the adults, this is the part that's so disturbing, strictly forbade anybody from revealing to them. So they had to keep it a secret that he had this sex change. So he grew up feeling like there was something wrong with him, not understanding why he was having these impulses. I can't believe nobody went to jail for that.
And that's the genesis of this whole movement.
It's just amazing.
And so maybe just we'll take a minute to back up and, what does the word gender identity even mean right now? As Anderson writes, if you listen to transgender activists, they'll say it's an inner sense of self. And that's actually the legal definition here in Massachusetts. It was passed, I think, originally in 2011, adding gender identity as a protected class along sex, religion, race. But a lot of people thought, well, this means you'll have to have an official diagnosis from a mental health practitioner, or perhaps surgery or hormones or something like that. No, it is purely subjective, an internal sense of self.
Is it up to 56 now, I think, the different
Well,
identities?
it's essentially limitless, right?
Yeah.
It's not even a binary. There's a gender spectrum, gender fluidity. So it doesn't even have to stay the same. So I can identify as a male right now, but I may identify as a female tomorrow.
Yeah.
So,
I tried to get my mother to read this book, and her response, I think, was the common, why would I waste my time reading about that? I think it is too overwhelming for people and too silly to take time to learn about it. The problem is the other side is standing on the rooftops with a blowhorn, and the one who, yells the loudest is the one who wins. And so that's what's happening. They're reaching the young people because we're not informing ourselves to the truth and exposing it, unfortunately.
And we need to speak about it, unfortunately, very often, because other than places like Mass Family Institute or in the family or sometimes in the churches, there's no other place where people are going to hear the truth. They're being inundated with this message, which really is sort of a new Gnosticism of dividing some inner sense of self, almost a spiritual type identity, from biological reality. And that's a very old heresy in the Christian church, for example. But as Anderson puts it, he says gender identity is merely a disclosure of how one feels. It's a good point here. He says the challenge for activists is to explain why the mere feeling of being male or female, or both, or neither, makes someone male or female, or both, or neither. Transgender activists want the authority of science as they make metaphysical claims. And so, this whole gender identity movement, again, grounded on this essentially pedophile, John Money, is being pushed to science. And there's no real objective, grounded science to it because it's all based on subjective feelings.
So in the book, he calls it Gnostic dualism.
Right.
And that's what...
Right, that the body can be manipulated, it's just material, it's just flesh. And you'll even hear sometimes people refer to humans as, well, we're just computers of meat. So kind of plug and play different components. Of course, from a Christian understanding, we see ourselves made as in God's image, male and female. He made us in his image. And so it's a totally different worldview than that sort of old Gnostic heresy, which is raising its head again in this transgenderism.
Did you find yourself having to get out the dictionary reading this book? There were these new words, new invented words. Every few pages, what is that?
Well, another one of them was, and I was trying to explain, I think to my dad or somebody recently, autogynephilia. There he is.
It's amazing.
What a term to come in on. Hey, Ryan, can you hear us or see us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
I can, yeah. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, happy to do it.
Just sort of talking through your book, and it's an incredibly well-researched book. I mean, you've got 30 pages of footnotes, and we were talking about the new terms we've had to learn to be able to, catch up on this movement.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, well, so glad you could join us. And I know the audience watching at home is excited to have you here. So welcome. Tell us why you decided or felt called to write this book on transgenderism, which some of our family members don't even want to read because they just don't want to get involved in the issue. You wrote a whole book on it. What made you do that?
So, two things really come to mind there. One was just like a sense of necessity. I was scheduled to go on, which Sunday talk show was it? This Week with George Stephanopoulos, the Sunday before oral arguments in the Obergefell case. And that Friday night, I was at a friend's, the rehearsal dinner for the wedding. And that was the night that Bruce Jenner, as he was then called, did his, 2020 TV interview special. And so then the next night at the wedding reception, I get a text message from the producer saying, hey, tomorrow morning when you're on with George, he wants to know if you could say a few words about the Bruce Jenner interview. And I had no idea who Bruce Jenner was. I didn't know about the interview the previous night. I had to go home early from the wedding reception and stream the thing online. And that was when I realized what was happening, that they were going to pivot from the LGB part of the acronym to the T part of the acronym. That they knew they had Justice Kennedy's vote. They knew they were going to win with the legal redefinition of marriage. And so the next thing kind of on their kind of political and legal agenda was going to be the redefinition of sex to be gender identity. So, that was the sign that this is coming. it's going to need to be responded to. But then the second thing that really convinced me, that I should do this and I should write an entire book about it, is that I had met some individuals who had transitioned and then detransitioned. And those stories, I mean, it's the type of thing that once you know the suffering people have gone through, and you have the wherewithal to do something about it, you can't say no. It's like that sort of a sinking feeling in your stomach of, I know better than what's going on. I've seen through kind of the lies on this issue. And if I don't do this, there's a chance that no one else will. Thankfully, that didn't come true, right? I mean, thankfully, my book was one of the first out, but then, a year or two later, Abigail Schreier published an excellent book on this. A couple of years after that, various other people have now written on this. But at the time, I was afraid I was going to be alone. And
why was yours the only one canceled?
That's an interesting question. I still don't know. My sense is that it's because it's holistic. And what I mean by that is that some books just focus on the childhood aspect. So, Abigail's book is great, focusing on what's happening to young people, and in particular to young women, to high school girls, college age women. Some books just look at the unfairness to women, right? Women's sports, women's spaces. Some books just look at the religious liberty aspect. My book was, it talked about children and adults. It talked about all the aspects of the public policy. It talked about all the aspects of the medicine. I also think, for better or worse, given that I had just left the Heritage Foundation and I was now the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, I was an outspoken critic of the Equality Act. All that took place within the matter of a few weeks. I switched jobs February 1st. The Equality Act hearing was February 20-something, and the book was canceled the day before, or maybe 2 days before the hearing. And so the timing was all very suspicious. We've never gotten a straight answer because they sold the book for 3 years, and then all of a sudden they decided it violated their content policy.
Yeah. And you're not alone, obviously, in being canceled for speaking the truth on this issue. Just over the weekend, you probably saw this. You have Leah Thomas, who's a biological male, very tall male swimmer. He sort of towers over the actual females, but he's swimming as a female. I think for Penn State and maybe UPenn, but he just won an NCAA Division I championship. And there was a young woman, I think her name is Reika Georgi, if I'm pronouncing it right, who would have made the finals. So she was sort of ranked 17, and it was 16 who swam in that finals. And she spoke up on Twitter, on social media, wrote a letter to the NCAA protesting the fact that, she lost her spot to a biological male, and she was kicked off Twitter.
Now, was she permanently kicked off, or was it, I don't know.
I don't know if it was permanent or not.
It happened, but it's just amazing to me right now that if you state simple truths, either, big tech, in the form of Twitter, or Amazon's technically not tech, right? It's just a big business, but it is a type of tech. They don't act, I guess they now have opened some physical stores, but largely they're the largest online retailer on the globe. Right? They sell more merchandise than anyone else on the globe. And so if they can, lock you out of the market, they are the marketplace to a certain extent. And you're right. It's not just me. There are other people who have been censored by Twitter, by Facebook for speaking the truth. And I think just over the weekend, the Babylon Bee was locked out of their account because, who is it? It's Admiral Levine was named Woman of the Year. Right, they point out that he's actually a man, and so they said he's Man of the Year, and so for that they were locked out.
Look, the guy's the father of 2 children biologically. He was married to a woman for I think a couple decades.
Charlie Kirk also today got banned for saying the same thing, so that should create a storm.
Yeah.
And what's interesting here is, I think some people say certain things like this, intending to kind of poke the bear. And there's a place for that. I don't necessarily say that as a criticism. I think the Babylon Bee frequently uses satire to show how ridiculous things have gotten. My book did not set out to do that, right? I actually wrote a book intending to not get canceled. I was trying to write a book that you could give to a family member, to a friend, to a student, that would be persuasive, that would be accessible to them. It wasn't meant to be, the own the libs rhetorical approach. And it still was unacceptable for Amazon. And I just think what that highlights is it's not so much how you say it, so much as what your bottom line is. If your bottom line is to embrace certain, socially conservative viewpoints, biblically orthodox viewpoints, natural law viewpoints, that goes against a new orthodoxy. And just like Christians jealously guard, true orthodoxy, we now have, woke progressives jealously guarding their orthodoxy.
I agree, and it's so difficult. It makes me think of that fable of the Emperor's New Clothes. Except in this case, when the child calls out, "Hey, he's not wearing anything," or "Hey, it's really a man," instead of that sort of breaking the spell, the Emperor's groupies just club the kid to death and move on.
And what's interesting that you mentioned that is that is the children's story that Dr. Paul McHugh has frequently referred to. And he said that, he has spent his entire professional career being that kid pointing out the emperor has no clothes. Because several times in his professional career, he's more or less blown the whistle and put a stop to, what he describes as kind of like the misdirection of medicine. First it was the recovered memory phase within psychiatry. Most recently, it was on transgenderism. In the 1970s, he was the chair of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. He was the psychiatrist in chief at Johns Hopkins Hospital. And he was the one that shut down the sex reassignment clinic at Hopkins. And it remained shut down until I think it was like 2016 or so, when they reopened it, not because of, new science, human nature hadn't changed and, science and medicine hadn't changed. They reopened it because of political pressure. The Human Rights Campaign had docked them in the score of the Health Equality Index. And they were saying, because you won't censor Paul McHugh, you're losing, I think it was like 25 points. McHugh is now in his 90s and he's still seeing patients. He's still sharp mentally as can be. He's just a wonderful human being. And he's been more courageous than anyone I know on this issue. Because, they've hurled all sorts of criticism at him. And he's like, look, I'm not going to be judged by these people. I'm not going to be judged by history either. Like, I'm a truth teller. It's why I went into medicine in the first place. I'm a healer. It's why I went into medicine. And it's the Emperor's New Clothes is exactly that story that he points to.
And he probably knows more about this issue than almost anyone else. And as I understand, the reason he sort of shut the clinic down was because it wasn't helping people.
He had, so I forget how many years at this point, Hopkins was one of the first hospitals, one of the first clinics to do sex reassignment procedures. And I think they opened it like was 1959 or something. It was late 50s, early 60s. And so by the mid 70s, when he becomes psychiatrist in chief, they have, nearly 15, 20 years worth of patient history. And he asked one of his colleagues, John Meyer, to conduct the study. And it was John Money was the guy who, kind of pioneered this at Hopkins.
We were talking about him.
Yeah. Was that story covered up? Why do not more people don't talk about that? I don't understand why I've never heard of this until I read this book.
Oh yeah. It wasn't covered up, and McHugh himself had written, it was when I was, if I think the chronology is correct, it was when I was still working at First Things. It would have been sometime in the mid 2000s, around 2004 to 2008, somewhere in that time frame. McHugh wrote an essay for First Things magazine titled Surgical Sex, where he talked about what was going on and how he had shut down the reassignment clinic. But there was a book written, what was the title? As nature would make her, as nature did make her. There was a full book length kind of expose.
Yeah, as nature made him, and the boy
Yes.
who was raised as a girl.
A girl. Yes.
But just the news that the first transgender boy ended up committing suicide, the very first one. And that news is not out there anywhere. Nobody hears that.
Yeah, and it was and not the story's even more tragic because it wasn't just that young boy; it was also his twin brother, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, they both did.
Both of them were ultimately traumatized by this experience, by the parents covering up. For people who don't know, I mean, this was a case of a botched circumcision, in which Dr. Money, his theory was that sex is merely physical, gender is a social role that we are culturally and socially educated into, socialized into. And so these are newborn babies, botched circumcision, just raise one as a girl, and just always tell one of your children that, he is a she, raise them with pink and Barbie, blah, 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 right? All the stereotypes. And because he thought that it was like the gender pathway is indeterminate until a certain age, if you raise this child as a girl, he'll believe it. And the reason why is that it was easier for the surgeons at the time, after the botched circumcision, to create a pseudo vagina than it was to try to repair the damaged penis, right? And so that's why he was saying, raise the child as a girl, just because it was going to be, technically, physically easier for the surgeons. And as a result, both of these children had their childhood taken from them. They both commit suicide later in life, in 30s and 40s, if I remember correctly. And it's just terribly tragic. And you're exactly right. This is never really discussed by any mainstream news outlet because they don't want to focus on how we got here, nor do they want to focus on what the current outcomes are. Our media.
Yeah, there's an article out there for anybody who wants more information. It says, what were the real reasons behind David Reimer's suicide? I would encourage you all to go look it up because it's absolutely fascinating and it needs more attention, I believe.
And that's on Slate, I believe, right?
Yes.
Which is not a right-wing conspiracy news site. So,
well, I mean, it also, I would suggest the British media is doing a much better job, like British mainstream media doing a much better job. The British courts are doing a better job. The Tavistock Clinic, I mean, some of the European clinics that pioneered puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for children, I think we can learn quite a bit from what's going on in the UK on this, because they're actually starting to have second thoughts. Similar things are true in some of the Scandinavian countries.
Yeah. And you mentioned, Ryan, that one of the reasons why you wrote this book is because of the desisters, the people who have come back out of this lifestyle, who stopped identifying as the opposite sex, that you wanted to tell their stories and help prevent that tragedy from happening more. I think unfortunately it has been happening a lot more. Are we seeing any shift with, because there are so many more that have kind of got sucked into this tragedy who are now sort of coming out? Has that first wave really hit yet, that we're seeing a lot of desisters, or are we not quite there yet? Or are they being suppressed?
We don't really know. I mean, that's the honest answer, because there aren't any like large, rigorous population-based studies on this. So it's all kind of anecdotal and news reporting, but based upon kind of, the anecdotes, the news reporting, there certainly seem like there are more people speaking out today than at any point prior in human history who transitioned and then detransitioned. But again, like to what large of an extent, we don't really know. And the only thing I would add is there are two different terms that are really important here. One is desistance and a desister, and the other is detransition and detransitioner. One would be someone who had gender dysphoria, might have identified as transgender, but then it didn't persist. It desisted, meaning, they grew out of it. And that's what happens 80 to 95% of the time with young children, if they're allowed to simply go through puberty and continue developing, that they will desist with the gender dysphoria. It will desist, it will go away. And then detransition is for someone who actually hormonally or surgically, transitions, and then a number of years later regrets it, and then detransitions, goes back to identifying and living as the sex that they actually are. And obviously there are limits to what medicine can do in terms of how much they can restore your God-given body, right? I mean, because once you remove body parts, they don't grow back. You can't surgically reattach, remove parts. Once you've been on synthetic hormones for a certain period of time, some of those changes can be irreversible. This is why Abigail titled her book, and it's a brilliant title, Irreversible Damage. That what we're doing to children by placing them on puberty blocking drugs, cross-sex hormones, and in some cases even surgical transition, this is a form of damage that in many cases will be irreversible. And even if you, for example, with puberty blockers, you don't get back the years that you blocked puberty. And if you blocked puberty long enough and then you took cross-sex hormones, you may never develop your reproductive organs. You may never have reproductive capacity. And when you're 12 years old, that might not seem like a big deal to you. But when you're in your 20s and 30s and all you want is to be able to bear a child and nurse a child, and you can't because you're on testosterone for 5 or 10 years, or because you never went through your biological puberty, those are, again, it's a form of irreversible damage. And it's on some of the most intimate and meaningful aspects of our humanity. I mean, some of the greatest joys that we have are, as parents, and because you made a mistake as a child, or, sometimes it's not even you made a mistake, your parents or the doctor. Frequently, I think the parents are also victims here, right? So parents
absolutely
are just trying to do the best they can for their kids. So they go to the best hospital they can find. And then it's the expert who says, place your child on these drugs.
Well, parents are told, I mean, they're essentially blackmailed that, I've heard parents that are told that they've got a daughter who identifies as a boy. Look, you can have a live transgender son or a dead daughter. Those are your options.
They threaten them with suicide.
Yeah.
It's a form of emotional blackmail. It's a form of psychological coercion. And they won't even say, would you rather have a trans son? They'll say, would you rather have a living son or a dead daughter? And that's the options that parents are presented with. And so many of them say, oh, I didn't know any better. And then, I've been in rooms, with parents who are, speaking through tears, seeing what has happened to their children. It's just incredibly heartbreaking. And so many in kind of like the pro-transition side of this just seem really callous about it. There's a YouTube video of one of the doctors in California saying, look, kids do stupid things all the time, but we let them get driver's license, we let them do this, that, and the other thing. And if after the double mastectomy you regret it, you can always get breasts later. Right? As if it's like silicone implants would, and it's just like the callousness of that video clip in particular.
It's like getting a little tattoo, right? You can have it taken off, no big deal.
Yeah. It gets me more and more upset the more I kind of like relive and because the book, I guess it's it's been published. It was published 4 years ago now. Yeah. And that means I was writing it, 5 years ago. And so it's actually, I have to remember as I speak about this, it gets me more and more upset because this is still going on. Children are still being harmed in these ways.
And to go back to one of the first things you said, that this sort of broke on your horizon right around the time of oral arguments in the Obergefell case, which enshrined same-sex marriage in our law as a constitutional right. I mean, I've heard parents say to me, man, I thought my daughter was transgender, but thank God she's just a lesbian. And I think encapsulated in that statement is the reality that, look, if you can normalize Bruce Jenner, right, a men's decathlon Olympic gold medal winner, you cannot get any more man than that. If you can enshrine him as a female, then, two guys getting married, it seems totally normal by comparison. So it's a very intentional way of sort of solidifying that ground that they gained in the culture war by moving on to the next phase of it.
And the other thing to add there is that it's not as if special interest lobbying groups, activist groups ever declare victory and shut down. And so, there were groups who...
There's no money in that, right? I mean...
No, and they were, the Human Rights Campaign has a very nice substantial building right in downtown DC. And what were they going to say? All right, we won on marriage equality, now we're done. They're saying, no, we're going to move on to the Equality Act. We're going to move on to the T part of LGBT. We're going to move on to the non-binary part, right? And this is also, something where we should be thinking about, all the extra letters that keep getting added to the acronym. What do they kind of stand for? What's kind of coming down?
And they said the same thing in Massachusetts in about 15 or so years ago, after same-sex marriage, first in the nation, was legalized here. They openly said, now we're going to fight for transgender justice. And so gender identity was added to the state's non-discrimination laws for education, housing, and employment and financing in 2011. And then public accommodations were able to hold that off until 2016. But yeah, it was a very intentional pivot to transgenderism as the next phase. And now in Somerville, Massachusetts, as well as I think Cambridge and was it Arlington? So the first three cities, at least Somerville was the first city in the nation to legally recognize polyamory. So for those of you watching at home, you look that one up, but don't Google it. But it's essentially, one man, multiple women, one woman, multiple men, or two of one, three of the other. Throw in some, gender fluid people. It's whatever. Multiple couplings recognized as marriage for purposes of insurance and benefits in the city of Somerville.
Just amazing.
Let me just add one thing that's really important to highlight here is that we were talking about how like the activists kind of pivoted, and all the groups that were kind of like the professional spokespeople on behalf of LGBT, et cetera, acronym. They don't actually speak for all people who identify as LGBT. And there's actually a really important, in the same way that like, Nancy Pelosi doesn't speak for all women. When Nancy Pelosi says, as a woman, I support abortion and this, that, the other thing, we shouldn't allow the activists to define, all the people that they claim to speak on behalf of. I have been, quite appreciative of the number of LGB identifying individuals willing to speak out against at least the more extreme excesses of the T. Now, what would be nice is if there was also some kind of like self-awareness that some of these things that we did got us here, right? There doesn't seem to be that type of introspection, but that's fine. I mean, I think we just disagree about that, right? And
Sure.
I think, alliances are going to make for strange bedfellows, and we have to agree to disagree. I've partnered with people, we disagree about abortion. They're pro-choice, they know I'm pro-life. We disagree about marriage. They know, I wrote books on this. They're in, some of them are in same-sex relationships. And they say, look, we're going to put all of that on hold for right now, because what's happening to children's bodies is unacceptable, and we need a partner for that. Or what's happening to women's sports is unacceptable. We need a partner on that. And I think that's a good lesson.
No, I was just at the end of the book. You mentioned the Hands Across the Aisle coalition.
Yes, they're a great group.
I actually stopped and I had to go research them, and I emailed the woman who runs that, because I thought how incredible right now, if this whole issue with the women's sports being taken over, if we are awakening the sleeping giant of the feminist movement, then I'm so excited, because that's all it's going to take, is that once they wake up and realize that this is going to circle back and hurt them, the feminists, then I feel like that's going to solve this issue. There will be no more men in women's sports.
I mean, here's the sad thing. I can't remember if this is in the book or not, because I don't remember the chronology now, but it might be in the paperback edition, in either the intro or the afterward. But I mean, some of the radical feminists, I had them speak at Heritage back when I worked there. Yeah. And, some of their opening remarks was, I can't believe I'm about to say this, but thank you to the Heritage Foundation for doing for me what no group on the left would.
Yeah, that's in the hardcover too. I remember that.
Yeah.
Oh, so it is. Okay. And this is my fear. I have not seen any mainstream feminist group speak out against what's happening with the UPenn swimmer, right? J.K. Rowling has, she's been heroic on this. A couple of other individual kind of like female leaders have, but none of the major kind of women's organizations.
I've
And
seen some
I think
protests.
I think there's a
Starting to see
disconnect between the grassroots and the
Yeah.
establishment, and I think it's largely because of intersectionality, right? And
Correct.
so it's the idea that if you are a political organization on the left, you have to be, on board with the entire political agenda.
Right. Like the intersectional flag actually represents that pretty well, and they're everywhere around here in Massachusetts. But it's the rainbow flag that has the sort of triangle pushing into it. The triangle's got is it pink and purple and white? That's the transgender colors, and then a light brown and a darker brown for CRT or BLM. So all of it together on one flag. And I remember after the George Floyd riots, you had Black Lives Matter really coming to the scene, but then almost immediately, like the next day, people were painting, I think in DC across the streets, Black trans women lives matter. Just so, yes, intersectionality, I think, is probably part of the cause for that. We've worked with a group, I think you mentioned as well in the book, WOLF, or Women's Liberation Front. So not a pro-family conservative organization at all, but at least they understand on this issue that embracing transgenderism does effectively erase women or all the progress that they've made. I mean, you see kind of snarky memes online that sometimes people suspended, but they'll say, look, men are even better at being women than women when they, point to Dr. Levine or Leah Thomas. And it's got to be infuriating.
I feel like people are being awakened though. I feel like there is a rumbling of seeing what's happening.
Well, I think you're definitely seeing a lot of parents. We're seeing this, in Virginia, thank goodness, but really all across the country, including here in Massachusetts. I think because of the extremism of what's going on in public schools, the fact that a lot of parents are more aware of what was going on because it was all zoomed right into their homes during COVID. Right. There is really an outrage about all of this stuff, but certainly the transgender issue. And what I'm seeing, because we've got a case here in Massachusetts, that is now, I'm seeing the same issue across the country popping up in headlines where teachers, counselors, school librarians are actively promoting, social transition to young kids and deliberately hiding it from parents.
Yep.
That appears to be a statewide policy here in Massachusetts that we're going to be challenging, but I'm seeing it popping up all over the country.
Yeah. Do you ever try to contact some of these parents? The Jessica Conan, I don't know if you're following this case in California, these parents. She was the one who spoke up at the school board. The mom and the teachers were coached her daughters to transition without her permission and changed. But do you ever try to contact some of these people, or do they contact you for help?
They have. I've been contacted by lots of parents over the past 4 years, and they're almost always heartbreaking conversations. And what I was going to add to the news reports of schools transitioning students without their parents knowing is that's not accidental. One of the things that the book highlights is there was a guide, I think it was titled "Safe for School." Safe for Schools or Transition Safe for Schools. I have the right title quoted in the book, but they had a section of the report on how to make your school safe for transition, where a student could transition without the parents knowing about it. And it had like an entire checklist of how you needed to have 2 copies of all the student documents, one with the new name, one with the old name, how you could, have the student have a second wardrobe at school. So, the parents drop them off at school, wearing pants and a button down, and then the student would go to the nurse's office or the principal's office and change into a dress, whatever, right? And they actually had a checklist on how to do this. And then the exact quote that, is coming to my mind right now is that, for students that have unsupportive families, even a slip up could make a dangerous situation at home. So It's important to have a plan in place. And they give you the guidance.
Kids are unsafe. Kids are unsafe in these homes, right? So the parents need to get with the program, or DCF gets involved. And we've seen that here in Massachusetts. The term that I've seen for several years now is highly rejecting parents. which is sort of a more aggressive phrasing, I think, of unsupportive parents.
Yeah.
And before you jumped on, I mentioned I got a letter from my town of Lincoln, where I live in Lincoln, Massachusetts. They're $71,000 to hire equity coaches for all the classrooms. So these are coaches that go in and help with this process. It's unbelievable.
Ryan, if we can take a step back, I know one of the questions or sort of the pushback you'll get if you make what to me is a very straightforward common sense argument that, look, there are two sexes. Gender's sort of kind of a made up thing with this Dr. John Money. We can get into that, but there are two sexes, male and female. It's genetic. It's 8th grade biology. That's the science. So all of this stuff is like you talk about, sort of a new Gnosticism. It's metaphysical. It's not science. But sometimes the pushback would be, well, look, that's not necessarily true. People can be born with, say, I think it's 2 X chromosomes and a Y chromosome or things like that. You do a great job in the book. This is where I think I learned the most, disorders of sexual development. How do you respond to claims that there's some sort of genetic basis to these things?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of thoughts there. I mean, one is to say that the disorders of sexual development have nothing at all to do with transgender ideology. There have been human beings with physical disorders of development, sexual development, disorders of sexual development, the acronym DSD, for as long as humans have existed. And they've never been confused about whether they're a boy or a girl, a man or a woman, male or female. And so part one. Part two, as far as we can tell, virtually all of people who are identifying as transgender or non-binary or gender fluid have no physical abnormalities whatsoever. As far as we can tell, they're kind of like fully physically developed men or women who identify as the opposite sex, or identify as both sex, or identify as neither sex. Right. So one thing to to start with is to make clear that the physical condition of a disorder of sexual development really has virtually nothing to do with gender dysphoria, what used to be called gender identity disorder, what's now kind of called as your gender identity, the idea that we just create our own gender identities regardless of the body. Second thing to say is that a disorder of sexual development is just like any other developmental disorder, right? You could have a disorder of cardiac development, and we would call it heart disease, a disorder of respiratory development, and we would call it lung disease. There are various ways in which our bodies can fail to fully develop. And with our sexual capacities, you could, have your body fail to fully develop a male reproductive system or a female reproductive system. You could have parts of both, although you will never have a complete reproductive system of both. You might have aspects of both. And the reason why is you could have chromosomal or hormonal underlying kind of causes for the disorder. So you could inherit from your father a Y chromosome. It's carried on his sperm, but his Y chromosome might lack the SRY gene. SRY gene is the sex determining region on Y. So even though you have a Y chromosome, you lack that gene, which means you will more or less develop as an infertile female. You would develop as someone who has Turner's syndrome, someone that has only one X chromosome. They develop as an infertile female because it takes 2 X chromosomes to fully develop the female reproductive system. There are a variety. I think it's what was it, Andrew? Like an 8-page section at the end of chapter 4, where I just go through, a bunch of these clinical conditions. Somewhere on my bookshelf, I have a clinical a book on pediatric endocrinology where they discuss how do you treat these conditions. Doctors have been diagnosing and treating disorders of sexual development for a long time, right? It has nothing to do with gender ideology, gender dysphoria. And so anyway, I think that's the basic line of how to think about this, is that the body can have developmental disorders just as it can be with other systems of our body. Respiratory, circulatory can also happen with our sexual reproductive capacities.
And they're also exceedingly rare. I mean, you point out, I think it's 1 in 5,000 overall for these types of disorders. And that's not what we're dealing with gender identity. Even by law, gender identity is defined by how you feel. There's no requirement for any sort of genetic test.
I thought it was really...
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I thought it was interesting. Shulamith Firestone, I'm going to mess up her name. You mentioned her, the book that she wrote calling The Dialectic of Sex. Fascinating that in 1970, there was this kind of dystopian idea put out there going after reproductive systems in women, just trying to encourage artificial reproduction to kind of like cast away the women so that we don't need her and we can have two men now having a baby. That this was kind of engineered in a book in 1970, this idea.
Yes, I mean, so it's an interesting connection on how a certain form of like second wave feminism, Simone de Beauvoir, Firestone, Betty Friedan, and others, more or less said that the sexes, gender is performative. So this is like a Judith Butler idea. And the sex, your physical sex, should have no bearing whatsoever on, how you live your life. One of them said, just as like, some of them were explicitly Marxist thinkers, where they said, just as like the purpose of the proletarian revolution was to get rid of different classes, so too the feminist revolution will be to get rid of different sexes. And in particular, get rid of the idea that females gestate the babies for all of humanity, right? And try to like redistribute the gestational roles. And the basic concept here was we have to liberate ourselves from the body. We have to liberate ourselves from biology, from reality. And so there's
the Gnosticism, right? We're back to Gnosticism again.
And
Yes.
they said they were going to use cybernetics to make it happen. So there was a direct steering the mind. There was an intention behind all of this, which I just found fascinating, starting back in 1970.
Yes, I mean,
Intentional steering.
lots of biotechnology here would be required for, and this is around the same time. The first IVF baby was born, was it 1979? Is that when Louise Brown was born? It's all, a lot of these developments, both on like assisted reproductive technologies, IVF, things like that, some of the second wave feminist thoughts about liberating ourselves from our bodies and from biology. This is all happening. And now we're going to a weird logical conclusion of it.
I have a question on that since you brought it up. Do you know if there's any research done on IVF and because I know people who have had twins and they're both homosexual, or did IVF in any way influence what we're seeing now with this kind of influx?
Not that I know of, but I also would imagine that there aren't very many researchers that would even want to ask that question or look into it.
Right.
And that is, this is, a downside of there not being enough conservatives in the academy, is that, which studies get proposed, which studies get funded, which studies get conducted. It's going to be much more heavily tilted on the left, because those are the foundations that are paying for these studies. Those are the people, all of the different PhD granting programs in gender studies and in transgender medicine, et cetera, are very explicit about what their ideology is. And there's nothing comparable for people who share our worldview in the academy.
And speaking of asking questions, I wanted to just mention there was a great video that's rolling around the internet from maybe a month or so ago. So Matt Walsh, conservative commentator, blogger, I'm sure you know him. He was on the Dr. Phil show, I believe, with a couple of people who identify as transgender. And he just asked the guy who identified as a woman, what is a woman?
Right.
Just give me a definition of woman. You say you are a woman. What do you mean by that? What is a woman? And they refuse to give him an answer.
Yep.
And I think ultimately, if you ask that question, it kind of gives the lie to this whole thing. Because if Bruce Jenner can be a woman, then what does it even mean to be a woman? And I think that's part of that whole push, even from the 70s, is just to destroy the definition or understanding of male and female in the first place.
To erase women. So.
Right, to erase them. Yeah.
It very much is a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman. And then you're like, well, what does it mean to identify as a woman? How do I know if I feel like a woman? Like, what's this inner? And it's entirely circular.
Yep.
There's no there. There's no grounding in any deeper reality. And so, I mean, what frequently happens is that they're trading off of stereotypes, right? And so this many feminists were very upset when Bruce, had the cover image where, he says, "Call me Caitlin." It was when he first came out as Caitlin. And they're like, look, that is a stereotypical pinup image of, what a kind of like seductive woman is supposed to look like.
Right.
And Bruce
I think he's literally trying to keep up with the Kardashians right there.
Right. And
which brings up the term, I guess, was what we were about to define when you joined us, which is autogynephilia. You mentioned in your book. I think I'd encountered it before, but just had to look it up again to make sure. The idea that some men who are sexually stimulated by the idea of themselves as a woman.
Yes, and that's, I mean, that was Dr. McHugh's kind of, it's not a diagnosis. He's not practicing medicine, but he said, look, it seems like Jenner would fit that type of adult transgender scenario. Is that, historically, the two most prevalent forms of gender identity disorder, as it was then called, gender dysphoria, as it now called, would be little boys who felt uncomfortable in kind of like stereotypical boy roles, and then middle-aged men who were attracted to the idea of themselves as the type of woman that they find attractive, and then making other people attracted to them as a woman, almost like a self-reinforcing circle there. And so McHugh said,
hence drag queens, right? I mean, that's sort of the drag queen.
Possibly, yeah. And those were kind of like the two historic forms. And this is why Lisa Lippman's research is so important, because she says, well, look, there's something new under the sun, because now we have all of these high school and college age girls identifying as transgender. There's a 4,400% increase in the number of girls and young women in the United Kingdom identifying as either boys or men or non-binary or gender fluid, gender ambidextrous. And it seems that something else is going on. So the subtitle of Abigail's book is "The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters," right? Because like what she's seeing is that it's particularly this increase, this explosion is happening to young women. And to my mind, it's not at all surprising that this is disproportionately impacting women, because our culture is incredibly inhospitable to women. The sexual demands placed upon women, the expectations, and what it seems like it seems like people are just opting out, right?
Right.
Opting out of their own femininity, opting out of their own female identity. And I think that's frequently what you're seeing with the people who increasingly are identifying as non-binary. Yep. They're just rejecting the entire framework.
Or asexual, which I think they shortened to ACE.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we've got a few good questions from the audience. I'd like to sort of hit some of those. One, and this is a short one, but do you know the suicide rate of those who do transition, right? The argument is they have to transition or they're going to commit suicide. What are the statistics of those who actually do transition, to the extent we know?
The best study we have on this was a study conducted out of Sweden. It's probably now a decade or more old. And it showed a 19 times greater likelihood of death by suicide in the general population. We also have a study, it's from one of the California universities. I'm forgetting if it was UCLA or UCSF, but it's where the Williams Institute is. That's UCLA. And it showed that adults who identify as transgender, 41% of them will attempt suicide at some point in their lives. And that's 10 times greater than the general population. And then the Swedish study is adults who have had the surgery 19 times more likely to die by suicide. And this, all of the studies that have the best data, the largest data sets, and that look over a longer period of time. So the best studies are the ones that show the poorest outcomes for people who transition. It's the poorly conducted studies that don't have a large data set, studies that don't have a randomized data set, studies that don't look longitudinally for long-term outcomes. Those are the ones that say transition makes things better. But the large data sets, the data sets that look historically, those are the ones that actually show the poor outcomes, including a study that came out early during COVID to much media fanfare, saying, I think it was the world's largest data set, shows that transition helps individuals. And then a year later, 7 different researchers had written into the journal saying, you analyzed the data wrong. This data actually shows that it makes things worse. And they were forced to issue a retraction, right? They actually issued a formal retraction. And what the data shows is that neither hormonal nor surgical transition improved mental health outcomes. And then on some metrics, it actually made things worse. I think we might have lost our hosts. Okay, we'll give them a second to rejoin us. I guess their connection might have died out on us. Okay. I've never had that happen before. I don't think they're coming back. They're back.
Okay, can you hear me now, Ryan?
I can hear you now.
Okay, great. So I think the problem might have been on our end here in the studio, but I think the audience is still there.
Yeah,
so
we all were here. You guys just disappeared for a while.
Oh, so that was us. Okay, so you froze. I thought you had frozen, but it was us. All right. Well, I'm glad it's just a personal problem for me. We're going to get logged back in, but. So you're talking about the suicide rate and how that is actually quite bad for people who do transition, which is consistent with what Dr. Mehu found, that it doesn't seem to solve the problem.
Yeah, he said we're cooperating with mental illness, which was
Right.
courageous. I'm surprised he's not thrown in jail for saying that. I think any other counselor would right now, but to say that it's cooperating with mental illness.
One of the other questions we had, Ryan, is on the legal issue. What is sort of the standing legally on this issue across the country right now? And I know since your book came out, you have the Bostock decision, the Supreme Court decision that found that the 1967 or so Title VII employment, federal employment law, where it uses the word sex, that, surprise, that does actually also mean both sexual orientation and gender identity. So that's the law of the land nationwide now. I know in Massachusetts, we've had gender identity across all of our protected classes. So education, as well as employment and public accommodations, so bathrooms. And most recently, and probably most disturbingly, we have the counseling ban, which prohibits counselors from trying to help young people, so people under 18, address these issues in a way that's not pushing them towards transition.
So a couple of things to say there. One is that, Bostock deals with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII of it, which dealt with employment law. It has not yet been extended either by the courts or formally by the Biden administration to Title IX. Because, both titles, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and then Title IX of the Education Amendments 1972 law, they both ban discrimination on the basis of sex. But I think there are good arguments that our people should make. These are arguments that the Trump administration made and refused to extend the logic of Bostock any further, to say, all right, look, the court ruled that in the employment context, it's discrimination on the basis of sex for you to treat a man who identifies as a woman differently than a woman who identifies as a woman.
Yeah.
Look, that's bad, right? It's a terrible legal argument. It's a sophomoric philosophy from Justice Gorsuch, and it's been roundly criticized by more or less everyone. But leave that as it may be, because I don't think there are currently votes to overturn Bostock. Oh. There should at least be arguments made not to extend it, to say, well, look, in an athletic context, a woman who identifies as a woman and a man who identifies as a woman are not similarly situated. And to have discrimination on the basis of any characteristic, they need to be similarly situated individuals holding all other relevant characteristics constant. And you're not holding all other relevant characteristic contexts constant. They're not similarly situated. So I think the same thing, you could be making that argument for school bathrooms, for school locker rooms, for school athletics, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, that was the position more or less that the Trump administration took. Same thing within Section 1557 of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. When Congress passed the Affordable Care Act early on in the Obama administration, they banned discrimination on the basis of sex. They actually incorporated the language from Title IX into Section 1557. And what they meant by that was you have to treat men and women equally when it comes to health insurance, when it comes to medical care. In 2015, maybe it was 2016, actually. It was 2016. May of 2016, the Obama administration said that word sex now means gender identity, and therefore all healthcare plans have to pay for sex reassignment procedures, hospitals have to offer it, doctors have to perform it, et cetera, et cetera. The Trump people rolled that back. They said, no, the word sex means sex, doesn't mean gender identity. We're expecting sometime in April that the Biden administration will now go back to where we were during the Obama years, and that the word sex will mean gender identity in Title IX, and therefore it'll be incorporated into Section 1557, and it'll be applied to our healthcare law. And that'll have huge consequences for education and for healthcare. I mean, both for just like, the soundness of what are we doing when we have different facilities for male and female, different sports for male and female, just the soundness of good medicine. But then also, as a consequence of the law now being unsound, there'll be religious liberty impacts. There'll be conscience rights impacts. And so it needs to be a two-pronged response. We can't just talk about the religious liberty side. We need to talk about the substance, but we can't just talk about the substance either, right? We need to be able to walk and chew gum simultaneously.
So these issues are going to be coming up to the Supreme Court. I mean, best case scenario, they'll be coming up to the Supreme Court over the next several years, and we'll see if we can get better decisions than Bostock. But they're not. I don't think they're going to be resolved any other way. I mean, on the flip side, I guess there's some good news out of Texas fairly recently. I don't know if it was a law or just an executive order out of the AG's office, but there they have essentially shut down these pediatric gender clinics, or said that if parents whose children are undergoing medical or surgicals or hormonal or, heaven forbid, surgical transitions at these gender identity clinics are going to be investigated by DHS, which is the exact opposite of what's happening here in Massachusetts.
And a doctor's now suing them.
Yeah.
So.
If I remember correctly, it was a state senator wrote a letter to the AG saying, look, we have a statute that prohibits child abuse. Well, what's the status of, a surgeon who removes the healthy breast tissue from a 13-year-old girl? And the reason I use that example is that there were two 13-year-old girls at a California hospital who had double mastectomies performed on their bodies with our tax dollars. It was an NIH-funded study. And the conclusion that the AG said is that would be an instance of child abuse under the legal definition that we have in the state of Texas. And so as a result, the largest, I believe it was the Houston Children's Hospital, or the Houston, I forget the exact name, but the largest gender clinic in Texas, pediatric gender clinic, was in Houston. And they said, we're not doing this anymore because they were afraid of legal consequences. And I think that's an entirely appropriate, we shouldn't be going after the parents. We should be going after the doctors, going after the clinicians, going after the hospitals, going after the so-called experts who are perpetrating, engaging in these actions on
and
children.
Profiting off of it. I mean, setting up people to be on synthetic hormones perpetually.
Which also raises the question of should the pharmaceutical companies know better? There were consumer deception and consumer, I think it was the Consumer Protection Act. It was how they went after some of the opioid producers, saying you guys should have known better when you were clearly selling more than could have been responsibly diagnosed and prescribed. you guys bear some responsibility. Is something similar going on right now with Lupron? Are puberty blocking drugs being used? I mean, they are being used off label. We know that they're not FDA approved for this. And are they being used to such an extent something that the manufacturers bear responsibility for? I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so leave that to the AGs to go after, but I think it's worth looking into that.
Absolutely.
Did you say they're not FDA approved?
Not FDA approved for treating this gender dysphoria. They're FDA approved for a condition known as precocious puberty, the early onset of puberty. And so the idea would be like, if you have a 6 or a 7-year-old going through puberty, that's biologically too early. There's a drug that you can place your child on to delay puberty until 9, 10, 11, an age appropriate stage. And that's what these drugs were developed, tested, and approved for. They're now being used off label to just permanently block puberty. So you just would never go through your biological maturation.
It's terrible.
And it's entirely.
And I think a lot of people don't know that it's essentially off-label use of these drugs. So it's almost by definition experimental at best.
Wow.
So hopefully there'll be some accountability. And it'll only take a couple successful lawsuits to shut these clinics down because the financial liability will be just too much. Another question.
I was just going to say, to close the loop there, some states have actually narrowed the statute of limitations on this, so it's harder to sue. And this is where I think it's going to be important that if this happens to minors, there needs to be, this is, it's not going to happen in Massachusetts, but a more conservative state could pass a law saying, if you did this on the minor, and when the minor's 25, 27, 28, and they regret it, you're liable, right? They could sue you for, I think we're going to need to have probably some statutes change. But I think even with the statute we have, it's worth a shot at bringing as many legal actions as possible. Because what's happening to these young people is just a grave injustice.
On a sort of more practical day-to-day level for, I think, a lot of us, what are your thoughts? This is in response to one of the questions, or a couple of the questions, actually. Words and language and terminology is important. So, as Christians who believe, again, God made us male and female in his image, we're sticking with sort of 8th grade biology, the basics here. Should we be using terms like gender identity interchangeably with sex? And should we be using someone's preferred pronouns, or is that dishonesty in and of itself?
So both questions, the answer is no. We should not use gender identity as interchangeable with sex, because it doesn't matter how I identify. I'm a man. I'm male. Right. And an adult human male is called a man, right? This is where, the Matt Walsh question of define woman, it's adult human female, right? I mean, there are meanings to words regardless of how we identify. That's the answer to the first question. Answer to the second question, no, you should not use preferred pronouns. Not only shouldn't you use preferred pronouns, you should reject the entire schema that pronouns are preferred. And so, if someone says, oh, well, put your preferred pronouns in your email footer, or when you introduce yourself on a name tag, just opt out, refuse to play along the entire way. And so if you're at a conference and like, oh, don't write your pronouns on your name tag, even if it would be for me, like he, him. Right. No, because it's not something that's preferred. These are words that describe realities.
And that may seem like
I'm just curious, when you meet somebody who does that, do you, being Ryan Anderson, do you address them?
Oh, I would find a way to speak that would avoid pronouns altogether. My advice to people is don't intentionally misgender someone, especially in a face-to-face. Like, there's no reason for you to speak in a way that's going to make someone else feel uncomfortable. There's also no reason for you to speak untruthfully. And those two things we need to keep in harmony. We should only speak truthfully, but if we can avoid giving offense, if we can avoid making someone feel uncomfortable, we should avoid it, right? We shouldn't intentionally speak in ways that make others feel discomfort.
And this is no small thing. I mean, numerous people have, again, contacted my office, very concerned because they're essentially threatened with losing their job if they don't go along with the pronoun scheme of a coworker. And interestingly, it's not typically the coworker who's complaining. Just anecdotally, it seems to come up in like a staff meeting where they're discussing, hey, we need to all use these new pronouns now. And someone says, I can't, because of my faith or out of good conscience, I can't use these pronouns. And it's kind of the woke HR person in the staff meeting that sort of puts their screws to the thumb there. So this is a real issue for people to lose their jobs.
Yes, and it's exactly right where it's coming from. This is just to highlight that for many people who identify as transgender, they're just doing their best to get on with life, right? I mean, most people are not activists of any sort, one way or the other, conservative, liberal, religious, secular. And, imagine if you felt so uncomfortable in your own body that you thought your only pathway to happiness in life was to take the opposite sex's sex hormone and to have surgeries. Most people in that situation aren't trying to draw attention to themselves, right? They're trying to blend in. They're trying to, get along with their colleagues. So frequently they're not the ones, making these demands of others. It is going to be the HR person. It's going to be someone who graduated from a woke elite university who's now trying to, again, to enforce a new woke orthodoxy.
And the law is not clear yet on who wins that employment case.
Yes.
There's been a few spats initially, but no real solid or clear decisions, nothing at a high level. So we'll see where that goes. But I agree with you. I think that's sort of a modern day pinch of incense to Caesar, as it were, for Christians. And it's a line in the sand that I think we need to draw. And
we should pray that ADF wins those cases.
Absolutely.
ADF is representing, in particular, some teachers. I believe they have a college professor case, the Merriweather case, and then they have the is it Peter Lamming case in Virginia, and then they also had the case of the gym teacher. What is his name? He teaches at the elementary school that it's not the one that I'm zoned for. It's the next one over. My kids will not attend either of them. But there have been some heroic teachers that have refused to go along, and they have paid consequences on this. And it's great that there's a law firm pro bono like ADF that's just doing this to defend good people who deserve defenses.
Yeah.
I'm curious, you just mentioned your kids. Have you faced this issue yourself with your kids being in the school system?
They're all still, I have 3 kids, all still are in diapers. Despite our best efforts at getting the eldest one potty trained.
This is going to be exciting to watch in a few years to see how it plays out with you.
Yes.
I think you need to write another book. It's interesting that you wrote the transgender moment when this has become much more than a moment. And in fact, you could write about 5 more chapters right now as an addendum. Have you thought of adding to this or writing another book?
Not right now, only because, in this box here, I have the page proofs to my next book, which is on abortion. And Ryan,
that dovetails to the kind of last question I want to ask you. It's from another audience member who herself is a therapist that works with some of these children. But she says, you mentioned in the chapter where you address biology, the medical understanding of the beginning of human life. Like activists in the abortion debate, it seems that transgender activists dismiss biological realities. Do you see the issues as connected? And when I read that, of course, I thought of your upcoming book, which I saw, I think, a post on social media. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely connected. And I had to make this point. There was a very good book written by Helen Joyce, just titled Trans. And I was asked to write a review of it for the Washington Examiner. And, I praised the book. And then I said, but look, there's some shortcomings here. Because at various points she's Irish, and she mentions that when Ireland voted to legalize abortion, it was one of her proudest moments. And I was like, wait, we can't take biological realities. And her whole argument is that we got to take biological reality seriously. No men in women's bathrooms, no men in women's sports. Identifying as a woman doesn't make you a woman. I said, well, wait, we've just trained 2 generations of people to deny biological reality. That, the child in the womb isn't really a child. The child in the womb is just a clump of cells. And there is some commonality both with how we had the abortion debate, how we had the same-sex marriage debate, and now the transgender debate, in which everything is plastic. Everything is up to our will. Carl Trueman, the rise of expressive individualism, that, it's all about me expressing my individualistic self. And it doesn't matter, what else happens, whether it's the unborn child or the institution of marriage to, biological reality. But anyway, just to wrap up, the book will come out in June. It's titled Tearing Us Apart, How Abortion Harms Everything and Solves Nothing. And the timing of this is meant to coincide with the Supreme Court ruling in Dobbs. Yes. And I think if the court does the right thing in Dobbs and finally admits they got Roe and Casey wrong, it's a new day for the pro-life movement. Wow. We're going to have the authority once again to legislatively protect unborn babies, right? To do this at the executive level, to do this at the state level, the federal level. And the book's co-authored with Alexander DeSantis, and it's really meant to kind of equip pro-lifers to now we're going to have to persuade people to vote the right way on all of these legislative initiatives. And so it's taking stock of the past 49 years after Roe and how everything abortion has touched, it's corrupted. It harms everything. It solves nothing. And Amazon's selling that book for right now. So
I was going to ask you. Okay.
Maybe we'll do it next year.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, we'll see. Yes, you come back.
Wow. Well, congratulations on the new book, and I hope that it is, coincide with a good decision, finally overturning Roe v. Wade. We'll be in prayer about that. Thank you so much for your time, Ryan, for joining us. Thank you for writing this book.
Yeah.
Again, When Harry Became Sally, you can get it at Christian Book Distributors, which is headquartered up here, or Barnes & Noble, and there's other places to get it as well, besides Amazon. Thank goodness it's not a complete monopoly yet. Excellent resource to have. And just for other resources available, this Parent Resource Guide, we have it available as a downloadable PDF on our website under the Resources tab, mafamily.org. We'll also mail you a hard copy if you call or email the office this week and let us know what your address is. We can mail you a hard copy as well. Ryan, in your book, you mentioned the need for a network of counselors and therapists who will help people. We've got sort of a small network here locally. We don't advertise them because of the potential legal implications, but if you or your child is looking for help on these issues, contact the office. We'll try to help you find somebody that will, address these issues from a Christian perspective. And if you're dealing with the pronoun issue or some other type of issue at work or at school and you think you might need legal help as well, we have good connections with Alliance Defending Freedom, First Liberty, Liberty Counsel, and other groups. We're happy to help you connect you with them and help you in that way as well. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us for the second annual MFI Virtual Book Club. You can always find out more at our website at mafamily.org. Hope you have a wonderful night. Take care and God bless.
That's great.